At the beginning of this year, I don't think I had ever read a fantasy book. And then in January, I picked up one. And now it's like 10, 11 months later. And I have read, I think, almost 50 fantasy books this year. I never thought I would be a fantasy girl, but now I totally see what the hype is all about. And I want everyone to be able to experience the feeling of loving a fantasy book because it is unlike any other. The level of escapism that reading can give you is just next level with fantasy books. And so today I'm going to be giving some recommendations for you if you want to start reading fantasy, but you don't really know where to start, you're a little bit intimidated. I'm going to give you my best tips, my best recommendations, and also talk through my experience a little bit because I feel like I get it. I was so intimidated by fantasy before I picked it up, and now I'm obsessed. Now, I just want to say, I am not an expert with fantasy books, obviously. I literally just picked up my first one this year. And for a while, I've been receiving so many comments being like, please make a video about fantasy recommendations for someone who wants to start reading fantasy. And I was like, I just feel like I can't make that video because there are so many other people out there who just have so much more knowledge about the fantasy reading world compared to me. But then I was like, you know what? I feel like I still remember what it's like to be intimidated by fantasy. And so I feel like I can give good recommendations because I remember what it's like to be that person. So yes, there are so many other fantasy books out there. And yes, some of these are very like basic, I guess you could say, but they're basic for a reason. Like a lot of people rave about a lot of these books because they're good books. Let's just jump straight into it, shall we? At the beginning of this year, I was book shopping and I walked into the bookstore and I saw this box set and I was like, I just feel drawn to this. And so I picked it up. It was the Folk of the Air trilogy, which is just the Cruel Prince series. And like I said, I'd never read a fantasy book before. I don't even know what caused me to pick this up. I definitely had seen it all over the internet, but it was just so not my style. Before that, I basically only read romance, but I picked it up and I read the first book and I fell in love with it. The Folk of the Air series is 3 books, obviously, and I ended up reading all 3 books within a couple weeks. I honestly was so obsessed. I personally think The Cruel Prince is a great place to start if you've never read fantasy before. It is YA, which means young adult, and I feel like YA is a great place to start if you want to start fantasy because often YA fantasy is a little less complicated, a little less intimidating, a little less intense compared to adult fantasy. Obviously, as a YA book, it's designed for younger people, like teenagers, so it's written in a way so that younger people will understand it, so therefore it's usually a little bit easier to follow. And I feel like the most intimidating thing about fantasy books is they can just be really complicated because it's a whole new world. Like when you read a contemporary novel, you know the laws, you know the social norms, you know what's normal to wear and to eat and how to behave and how people interact. But when you enter a fantasy world, there's a whole new set of laws, there's a whole new world, there are all new creatures, the names of things are different, the behavior is different, or it can be, and that can just be scary. So YA is a great place to start, and I personally think The Cruel Prince is a great place to start. This fantasy series and world includes the Fae, which are the fairies. And I'm not talking about these type of fairies, I'm talking about these type of fairies. And when I first read this, I thought that every other fantasy book that I was going to pick up after this would include the Fae and would include fairies and would include almost like these types of laws and this type of world building, but that is not the case, so I just want to preface that. Fantasy books don't have to be Fae, don't have to include fairies or these types of creatures, but some of them do. And personally, they're my favorite. I love books about the Fae, but I also want to say, if you start this book and you are confused, that is so okay. If you pick up any fantasy book and you start it and you are confused, that is normal. That is so fine. So many of these books, especially the first book in the series, I picked up and was like, I have no idea what's going on here, and I felt so lost and so like, why am I reading this? But I promise you that you will get the hang of it and things will start to make sense and you'll get so used to it and so consumed by the world that you'll honestly stop thinking about it. But just keep going. Just keep persevering and I promise it will begin to make sense. Another reason why I think The Cruel Prince is a great place to start is because obviously, like I said, it's a trilogy and some fantasy series are so incredibly long. I will also say it is very normal for fantasy books to be part of a series. There's not really, I don't think I have any recommendations that aren't part of a series just because that's my preference and because that is more common when it comes to fantasy books. But this series is definitely on the shorter side compared to other series that I might show you or talk about. Only 3 books, like I said, they're all YA, so they're a little bit easier to understand, and all the books are quite short as well. I think they're all around 300 pages, so you can fly through these super quickly. In this book specifically, we follow Jude, and she is actually a human living in Elfheim. Her parents were murdered when she was very young, and she was taken by the fairy who killed her parents and brought into Elfheim, because in this book it's almost like parallel worlds. There's a human world and then there's like the fairy lands, and you can actually travel between the two if you please, but the humans don't know the fairy lands exist, and the fairies mostly stay out of the human world. I will say a lot of fantasy books also include humans, and this is one of them. So like I said, Jude is actually a human, and she's got a twin sister Taryn, and they are really frowned upon because they're human. And they're teenagers, they go to school, and a lot of people don't like them because they're humans. They kind of get bullied because they're humans. And Jude is basically just like sick of being treated like this, so she kind of starts to fight back, I guess, and she kind of builds some enemies, and it all kind of just goes from there. I don't want to say too much about what this is about because it just... there's so much that goes on, but I really like the plot in this story. I really like the character development. There is a little bit of romance, but it's not like as all-consuming as some people make it out to be. I feel like some people are like, this is a fantasy romance, and I would say it's like a fantasy with a smidge of romance, and the romance is so good. I love the romance, but don't get into it expecting it just to be a romance, because it's in there, but it's not the whole thing. And I will also say, if you like romance already, fantasy romance is a great place to start, because you already know that you're going to love a decent part of the book. I honestly could talk about all of these books for so long, but we need to move on. If the idea of the fae, the fairy lands, the fairy creatures, all that sort of stuff is still a little bit intimidating to you, and you want to delve into fantasy but maybe not deal with all of that yet, I would definitely suggest Shatter Me. Now technically I would argue that Shatter Me is more dystopian than fantasy, but it's kind of a bit of both. It is dystopian in the sense that it is kind of set in the future of our current world, where the government has failed, and so there's this new kind of organization that has kind of replaced the government, and they are trying to run the world. The world is broken up into sectors. Each sector is controlled by a different government type leader, and the world is just very sad and bleak and falling apart. And in this story we follow Juliet, who is locked away in kind of like an asylum type of situation because she has lethal touch, and that's kind of where the fantasy element comes in. So we are reading through the perspective of Juliet, who has this power, I guess you could say, which I guess is a fantasy element, where if she touches anyone they will die immediately, and so for the safety of the public she has been locked away. So if you think the fairy thing is too much for you, I definitely recommend this, because it's, yeah, I would say it's more dystopian than it is fantasy, but it does include fantasy elements. This is so fast paced, it is so easy to read. It also has a really strong romance component in it as well. Now this is not a negative thing to me, but I just want to make it very clear that this series is quite lengthy. It's definitely not a short series, so just be mindful that if you want to delve into this series, it is definitely on the longer side. There are 6 main books and also a few novellas. You don't have to read the novellas. I do think they're worth it, but obviously it is up to you. And I personally love a long series, but I also know that's not everyone's cup of tea, so I wouldn't recommend this if you don't want to read a long series. But this is just probably one of my favorite series I've read this year, because it's just so fun, fast-paced, adventurous, suspenseful. Like there's always so much going on, and the romance is just so freaking good. I loved it. Another series that you might have heard a lot about is the Shadow and Bone trilogy. This trilogy is part of a bigger series world. I'm not exactly sure what you would classify it as, but it is called the Grishaverse, and it includes these 3 books, these 2 books, and another 2 books. I could be getting those wrong. I haven't read the other ones apart from these 5, but it basically just means that all the books that are included in the Grishaverse are part of the same fantasy world. So a lot of the same powers, a lot of the same kind of like laws and rules and world building. And so once you read Shadow and Bone, you can kind of go into the other books in the Grishaverse and have a really good understanding of what the world is, who the people are, what type of powers are kind of available or present in society, which is kind of nice because when you go into other books, you don't have to go through the whole process of world building all over again, which some people don't like. I'm pretty sure the Shadow and Bone trilogy is technically like the first part of the Grishaverse, and you're supposed to read it first. So it goes Shadow and Bone, Siege and Storm, and Ruin and Rising. I read and loved Shadow and Bone. It wasn't as complex as the Fae kind of stories that you get. Again, this is YA, so a lot of the recommendations I have for you are YA because I find them a lot easier to understand and get through. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought the plot was really interesting, and it was overall just a great time, and these books are quite short as well, so again, a little bit less intimidating. However, I feel like these next 2 books fell so flat in comparison. Now, obviously, you can have your own opinion and you may think differently, but a lot of people tend to have a similar kind of experience. A lot of people really enjoy the first book and then don't seem to really enjoy the other 2 books as much. Again, that's just like the general consensus. You may have a different experience. And a lot of people say that you have to read these 3 books before you can move on to the Six of Crows duology, which are also part of the Grishaverse and also take place in the same world, but it's not the same characters. So some people say you have to read the Shadow and Bone trilogy before you read these, even though the characters don't really overlap. There are a few names that are mentioned in this that were present in this series, but that's about the extent of it. So personally, I think, and this is controversial, not everyone will agree with me, and so do whatever you want to do, I think you can read these books without having to read the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and I personally don't really think the Shadow and Bone trilogy is really worth your time in comparison to these 2 books. But these 2 books, I rated 5 stars, both of them. 5 stars, 5 stars. So freaking good and so much better than the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So if you have read the Shadow and Bone trilogy or you've started it but you haven't finished it, I would still recommend going to this duology. And if you haven't started that but you feel like you should before going into these, I honestly suggest just going straight into these. Yes, you might be a little bit confused at the start, but you'll catch on, it'll be fine, and it's honestly just so much more worth your time, I think. So the Six of Crows is the first book in this duology, followed by Crooked Kingdom, and these books follow a group of 6 delinquents, I guess, who are all very good criminals, basically. And they all have different strengths and weaknesses, and so they've all been brought together by Kaz, who is the head of their little group of 6, and he brings them together to complete this seemingly impossible mission, heist situation where they have to steal something and bring it back to the guy who has hired Kaz. And the amount that they will be paid to complete this mission will basically set them up for the rest of their lives, and they just like won't ever have to worry about a thing. So obviously they're all so into it and so like desperate to complete this mission, and it's just so much fun. The characters are just so good. There's a huge sense of found family. I just love this duology so much, and in my opinion just so much better than the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and I just cannot recommend it enough. Alright, a very common or basic recommendation that I have is ACOTAR. You have probably seen this book. Even if you haven't read this, you've probably heard about it, you know about it, or you've at least seen the cover. This is just iconic at this point. I feel like a lot of people who don't read fantasy have still read ACOTAR, and honestly, as they should. This is such an incredible series. The first book is A Court of Thorns and Roses, then we have A Court of Mist and Fury, and then we have A Court of Wings and Ruin, and these are the first in the main trilogy. These books are all from Farah's point of view and all follow her storyline predominantly. Obviously, a lot of other characters are involved, but it's predominantly Farah's story. Then we have A Court of Frost and Starlight, which is a novella. A lot of people love to hate this and kind of just give it bad reviews all the time. It's a novella. It's not going to be as good as the main like original trilogy, but it's fun. It's more lighthearted. There's no huge plot going on. It's just fun, and we get a lot of POVs in this book, a lot of characters that we haven't read from their POV before, and it's honestly just kind of there to link you to the next part in the series, which is kind of like not necessarily a spin-off, but I'm pretty sure originally Sarah J Maas was only going to write these 3 books, and then people loved it so much that she continued writing. So we have obviously this book, like I mentioned, and then we have A Court of Silver Flames, which is from Nesta's point of view, who is Farah's sister. And I don't want to get this wrong because there are a lot of ACOTAR like stans out there, but I'm pretty sure all the books that we're going to get from this ACOTAR series, because it is ongoing, she is still writing this series, we're going to get more books from this series in the future. And I'm pretty sure all of the books that continue are going to be from different characters' POVs that we saw in these first books. So I don't know whose book is going to be next, but I don't think Nesta's going to get another book, forgive me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of where we're at with the ACOTAR series so far. But kind of similarly to The Cruel Prince, this book follows Farah, who is a human, and one day in the woods she kills an animal to support her family and to like feed her family because they are dirt poor, and Farah is basically in charge of supporting her family. It's just her dad and her 2 sisters, but her dad is injured, he can't work, so it's really up to Farah. And so she makes this kill of this animal, moves on with her life until someone comes to basically punish her for doing that, and it turns out that the animal that she killed wasn't really just an animal, and it's a whole lot more complicated than that, and she gets kidnapped by a fairy in order to punish her. So she gets taken away from her family, and the story kind of goes from there. But I will say, when I picked this up, I honestly did not know what was happening for probably the first half of the book. The first half of the book, I was like, I don't know who these people are. I don't know what this land is. I don't know who's talking right now or who they're linked to or what they're saying or what's happening. Like, I was so lost and so confused the entire first half of this book. But after that point, it clicked. I finally understood who the characters were, and it was all starting to make sense. The behavior was making sense. A bunch of plot twists kind of come in and you're like, oh my gosh, what the heck? And the ending is so freaking good. So if you start this book or you've started it in the past and you weren't able to make it through, I beg you to just try and finish it. I beg you to make it past halfway, keep reading it, and I'm like 70% sure that it will click for you by the end of the book. If you're paying attention to what you're reading, they will get to a point where it will click for you and it will make sense, and the story just gets so much better after that point. But yeah, I just want to encourage you. If it doesn't make sense at the start, that is okay. That is so normal. There are so many fantasy books that I've read where I've picked them up, not understood what was happening for the first half, or maybe even the first book, but once it clicks, it is so worth it and it is so good. This series is probably one of my biggest recommendations ever because the found family and character development that happens over the course of this series is some of the best I have ever seen. I don't think I've ever been as attached to a set of characters as I am now with the ACOTAR inner circle. They are just on a different level of found family. I feel like fantasy in general just has such great found family, and if you're a sucker for found family like I am, you need to start reading fantasy first of all, but you also just specifically need to read the ACOTAR series because every single book, it just gets better. So I cannot recommend the ACOTAR series enough. And while we're talking about Sarah J Maas, however you want to say it, I've got to talk about Throne of Glass. Got to talk about it. So Sarah J Maas currently has 3 series. The ACOTAR series, the Throne of Glass series, and the Crescent City series, which I haven't read. Throne of Glass is the first book that she published, and so it's like the first kind of series that she ever wrote. ACOTAR is the second series that she wrote, and Crescent City is the third. But a lot of people suggest to read ACOTAR first, and then go to Throne of Glass, and then go to Crescent City, which is what I have done. And I'm not exactly sure why they suggest to read ACOTAR first. I honestly don't quite know, but that's the way I've read it, and I definitely recommend doing it that way. I do think that ACOTAR is stronger as a series in comparison to Throne of Glass, at least for the first few books. Like once you get into Throne of Glass, I would say it's just as strong as ACOTAR, like first books. She wrote this when she was like 16, so like of course it's not going to be as strong as ACOTAR. So if you want to take reading order advice from me, I would say start with ACOTAR, then move on to Throne of Glass. So obviously I started Throne of Glass this year as well, and I'm actually currently right at the end of the last book. I only have like 10 chapters left, which is wild to me, and I'm so sad that this world is over because I've also become so freaking attached to the characters in this book. This series follows Selena, who is an assassin who has basically been imprisoned in this really awful, almost like prison camp, I guess. And she gets taken out of that to compete in this king's game, assassin game thing, and that's kind of how the series starts. We meet Selena and we just kind of start reading about her story, and throughout all of the books we meet a lot of other characters who all have their own storylines. There are so many subplots, there's so much romance in this book. Also, that's actually another thing I should mention. I would say the best way to compare these two series is this is romance with fantasy and this is fantasy with romance. This series is very strongly romance focused, obviously in a fantasy world, whereas I would say that this series is way more plot focused, but it does have romance in it, and the romance is really good. So both of them include romance, but this probably has more focus on the romance itself, I would say. And I would say that I prefer the plot of Throne of Glass, but I prefer the romance in ACOTAR. But again, this is just another phenomenal series. I'm so glad I read this year. If I'm being honest, I enjoyed the first few books in the series a lot. Like I really enjoyed them. But I would say that the series really starts getting good when you get to Heir of Fire, which is the 4th book if you include the prequel. When you reach Heir of Fire, I feel like everything just like changes and you meet so many new characters, and then the rest of the series just kind of builds on that. So again, I would really encourage you to stick it out until you at least get to Heir of Fire. Even if you're not loving the first few books, I still love the first few books, but if you're not loving them, stick it out to Heir of Fire and then you can make your mind up after that, because I feel like that's when it really starts getting good. Also, please Google the reading order because there's a bit of controversy about when to read this book and I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Those are probably like my biggest recommendations, but a few other fantasy books that I really have loved. I've got to say that these Hollow Vows, Your duology. It was one of my favorite reads from this year as well. I also think this is another great place to start if you haven't delved into fantasy before, because it's only 2 books. They're both YA. They're a little bit easier to understand. These ones are like fairy related stories with the fae. This duology also has a really strong romance component, which I really enjoyed. I feel like I loved this a lot more than other people that I've seen read it. Like, I've seen a lot of people give this like 3 stars, 3.5, 4 stars. I rated both of these 5 stars. Like, I loved them so much and I binged them both. I thought the plot was really good, the romance was really good, but again, each their own. Can't promise you'll love any of these books, but I personally loved these. Then we have Legendborn. This is such an interesting fantasy book because it is just quite different from any of the other ones that I've spoken to you about. Legendborn is based around Arthurian legend. So in this story, Bree is in high school, but she gets into this like early college program. I can't remember exactly what it is, but she goes off to college for this program. She lives on campus and she goes to this like field party, forest party situation, and she sees something that she doesn't quite understand. It looks like magic, but Bree doesn't even think that magic exists. So she's kind of just confused. And then she also finds out that her school or her college that she's at has a lot of secret societies. And one of those societies she becomes very intrigued about. And this secret society revolves around Arthurian legend. So it's very hard to explain until you read it. And I'm not gonna lie, this was a little confusing to me because I just like don't know anything about King Arthur or anything to do with any of that. So I found it kind of confusing and a little bit harder to follow in comparison to other fantasy books that I've read, but I still think it's so good. This book also talks about grief because Bree has recently lost her mother, so that is a really great element of it. And it also talks a lot about heritage, culture, racism. Like, it has so many great themes in it, and I definitely think it's worth it. Also, the sequel literally just came out, so it's probably the perfect time to read this. But yeah, it is a great fantasy book and quite unique in comparison to other ones that I've read, so definitely check it out. And lastly, we have the Prison Healer trilogy by Lynette Noni. This is yet again another YA trilogy, and I enjoyed this and I would still definitely recommend it, but it's not one of my top favorites, and it's not a series that's really like stuck with me or stuck out to me compared to other series that I have picked up. But I did want to mention it because I think this is again one of those series that is so easy to understand. The world building and just like the explanations of like who people are, what they do, their jobs, the world itself, the laws, all of that sort of stuff is explained so clearly in this series that I think if you are scared or a bit intimidated by the fantasy world, this could be a really great place to start. I just didn't really connect as much to the characters or the storyline as a whole, so it's like harder for me to recommend it, but it's just a really great place for beginners to start, I think. Or even if you're not a beginner, it's still a really great book to read, but it's just like not one of my absolute favorites. But The Prison Healer is kind of self-explanatory. It is about a prison healer, but a prison healer is basically a nurse, a doctor, someone who works in the infirmary or the hospital of the prison. And this story is about Kiva, who her dad was a prison healer and she was kind of brought into the prison by default because her dad got arrested and she kind of had to go with him because she was too young to look after herself, and she learnt a lot from her dad when he was the prison healer. So now that she is older, she has become the next prison healer, and the story kind of builds from that. She kind of makes some new friends, and there are some people that come into the infirmary or the hospital that she has to look after who are very important people, and Kiva kind of gets mixed up, not in the wrong crowd necessarily, but basically just in a more complicated situation that she really intended to be caught up in, and kind of just goes through a pretty rough experience because of it. So obviously there are 3 books in the series and there is romance in this series as well. But I think I am done. I think those are all the books that I wanted to share with you guys today, all the recommendations that I have for you. Hopefully I can do an updated version of this in another like 6 months or a year and share even more fantasy recommendations with you all, because like I mentioned, I have just fallen in love with fantasy books, and I feel like I have grown so attached to so many stories and so many characters this year because of fantasy books. So hopefully this has inspired you to pick up a new fantasy book, or maybe your first fantasy book. Please let me know if you do pick up one and you enjoy it. Let me know your thoughts, DM me on Instagram, or even just leave a comment here if you end up picking up any of these. I would just love to know. Obviously I know that not every genre is for everyone, but I definitely think it's worth giving it a shot. But I love you guys so much. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you in my next video very soon. Goodbye.